Tuesday night was a big night for Democrats. This was not just a good night for them. It was bigger than they would have expected. And I can tell you what surprised me. I mean, did I expect Spanberger to win, Sherrill to win, and Mamdani to win? Yes, yes, and yes. But it was the fact that Spanberger was able to win by double digits, and she dragged Jay Jones, the controversial attorney general candidate, across the finish line. A candidate, by the way, that Spanberger did not re-endorse after the controversial text messages became released. He certainly underperformed Spanberger by a good 5 to 7 points. But she won by such a big margin. Democratic turnout was so big that it was enough to overcome that. So I would say be careful assuming, one of the quick knee-jerk takeaways of this might be, character doesn't matter, right? We've seen it with Donald Trump. Now we've seen it with Jay Jones. How many times we've seen it with Bill Clinton, right? How many times do we need to be reminded of this? And then I would say, well, look at the margins. But for in a different national political environment, these texts would have cost Jay Jones the election. That's the bottom line. But because it was such an awful environment for Republicans and such a good environment for Democrats, that ended up, it looks like it doesn't matter, but don't kid yourself. Go look at those margins. It did matter. It just didn't cost him the election. But that's the point here. That's how big the Democratic turnout was. Take a look at the state of New Jersey. Jack Ciattarelli essentially hit all of his targets that he did 4 years ago in 2021 when he came within 3 points of Phil Murphy. It was a pretty competitive New Jersey governor's race. Well, he hit those same numbers. But the turnout among Democrats was so much greater in the Democratic areas that Mikey Sherrill won rather comfortably. So it was a huge turnout. Basically, Democrats showed up, base Republicans did not. And in fact, the best example of this was not in New Jersey, was not in Virginia, not in New York City. It was in Georgia. They had 2 public service commissioner races. And for those of you that don't live in the South, this is a little bit more of a Southern state thing. And there's a few other states that do it this way, where essentially the group of folks that oversee the public utilities in a state that help approve whether they can have a rate hike on your electric bills. And by the way, I'm going to get to the electric bills issue in a minute. In some states, these are elected officials. In some states, they're appointed by a governor or appointed by a legislature. In this case, these are elected officials. Now, these are 2 Republican incumbents. Neither of them had ever faced voters before. They were appointed by the governor and then had to stand for re-election. There was a bit of this was sort of there had been a lawsuit. If you want to get some of the details about this race, I encourage you to go deeper on this and why these 2 seats were on the ballot essentially for voter affirmation on whether they were going to accept the appointee or whether they wanted this alternative. But what you had in Georgia was a fairly low turnout. And there wasn't a lot of money spent in those races. So it was essentially a test of whose voters showed up. And this is a battleground state, right? Georgia, frankly, is a state that I think of as still a bit light red. When you look at where Democrats carried it in 2020, won a couple of Senate seats in the runoff after Donald Trump essentially messed up those runoff races. Raphael Warnock wins in 2022, but gets forced into a runoff by essentially the worst Senate nominee that Georgia Republicans have had in a generation. But it took a runoff for him to win. So I've been a bit skeptical that Georgia truly is a battleground state, that maybe it was just sort of it's still a lean red state that Democrats have to catch a few breaks in order to win statewide. And in particularly state level races, they had been getting crushed. They hadn't won a state level race, I think, since 2009, when a gentleman named Michael Thurmond, who happens to be running for governor this time, was able to win a low level down ballot statewide race. And here we are. And it wasn't even that close. It was a wipeout. Now, I will say that and I think this is a little nugget that people ought to be aware of. I wouldn't be surprised if some voters simply went into the polls and said, my electric bill's too damn high, I'm voting out the incumbent, right? And there was a denotion of who the incumbent was. And so I don't want to underestimate the power of pissed off voters about their electric bills having an impact when you get to directly express your frustration to the public service commissioner who oversees rate hikes. But this was a generic test of the two parties. And I'll tell you this, if I'm John Ossoff, the Democratic senator up for re-election in 2026, the most vulnerable Democratic incumbent senator in the country, I think it's fair to say, you feel a heck of a lot better about your chances today than perhaps you did yesterday. Look, he's a fundraising juggernaut. He's going to have plenty of money. He's catching a break that Republicans can't settle on a nominee. Brian Kemp's got his choice, and the son of former Georgia football coach legend Vince Dooley. It's Derek Dooley. You got two other candidates vying. They're all vying for the Donald Trump endorsement. None of them have gotten that just yet. You got Mike Collins in this race, son of Matt Collins. Buddy Carter running as well. So it's he's catching a break. There's a lot of money is going to be spent between these three guys just trying to get this nomination. But now I'm starting to think I assumed that the governor's race was sort of a soft R lean here. Yes, Brian Kemp is term limited, especially if a guy like Brad Raffensperger, the outgoing Republican Secretary of State, gets that nomination. But now you have to be pretty bullish about Democrats' chances up and down the ballot in the state of Georgia based on these results. This episode of the Chuck ToddCast is brought to you by Wild Grain. Wild Grain is the first bake from frozen subscription box for artisanal breads, seasonal pastries, and fresh pastas. Plus, all items conveniently bake in 25 minutes or less. Unlike many store-bought options, Wild Grain uses simple ingredients you can pronounce and a slow fermentation process that can be easier on your belly and richer in nutrients and antioxidants. Wild Grain's boxes are fully customizable. They're constantly adding seasonal and limited time products for you to enjoy. In addition to their classic box, they now feature a gluten-free box and a plant-based box. I checked out the gluten-free box, and let me tell you, they have a gluten-free sourdough bread. We got 2 loaves of it, and we've done 1 loaf already. It's a cranberry and almond sourdough bread. It's like the best raisin bread you've ever had, except it's not raisins. It's hit or miss if you mess around in the gluten-free bread world. This is a hit. This is well done. It's not heavy. It doesn't feel like a rock. Anyway, I was impressed. So look, for a limited time, Wild Grain is offering our listeners $30 off your first box, plus free croissants in every box when you go to wildgrain.com/ToddCast to start your subscription. $30 off your first box when you go to wildgrain.com/ToddCast. That's wildgrain.com/ToddCast, or simply use the promo code ToddCast at checkout. Always use the code, get the discount. I'm telling you, it's excellent bread. But look, this wasn't just Virginia or New Jersey or Georgia. In Pennsylvania, Republicans threw a bunch of money trying to throw out a few Supreme Court justices. They have an up or down. These were retention elections. And then if the voters choose to not retain the Supreme Court justice, the governor would appoint a temporary, and then there would be an election in 2027 to let the voters decide who the long-term justice should be. And Democrats beat back all of those sort of attempts by Republicans to upend that Supreme Court. It's a 5-2 majority right now in favor of the Democrats. That has 2028 implications, right? Who's going to be making the decisions about ballots and about whether what time the polls should stay open to, or when early voting should begin, or what's the signature rules when it comes to absentee ballots. These little things matter, but more importantly, organizationally, the party engaged here, and yet they got swamped. This was a repudiation of Donald Trump, and here's why I say that. If you look at the exit polling, and certainly if you look at the polling that I highlighted in my Monday podcast, the Republican Party brand is in better shape than the Democratic Party brand, right? The Democratic Party has some of the highest unfavorable ratings it's had in decades. And in fact, in the network exit polls, they did do a collective exit poll. The Democratic Party had an unfavorable rating in the state of Virginia of over 50%. That didn't prevent Abigail Spanberger, the Democratic nominee for governor, from having the biggest victory of any Democrat in 40 years. And it's the biggest victory of any candidate for governor since Bob McDonald's victory in 2009. So despite the unpopularity of the Democratic brand, Democrats won big. So how do you explain it? 2 words: Donald Trump, because his unfavorable rating is basically equal to the Democrats. Donald Trump's brand is in worse shape than the Republican Party brand. And that is the driver. As I always say, presidents create the political weather. We use a lot of, I use a lot of weather metaphors when it comes to politics, right? Collectively, the entire political analyst community uses a lot of weather metaphors. So sticking with that metaphor, it is a president that creates the weather. It is his political environment, especially a second-term president, especially someone who has got such control of his party. And this is where his reaction, I think, tells you where this could be. And I think the next 3 weeks are going to be fascinating inside the Republican Party as this finger pointing starts to set in. Donald Trump, for whatever reason, just handed Democrats more leverage on the government shutdown debate. Why do I say he handed Democrats more leverage? Because he chose to blame the shutdown for the losses of the Republicans. So in Trump's view, because remember, nothing is Donald Trump's fault when things go badly. When things go badly, in Donald Trump's world, you have to find someone else to blame. Donald Trump is not going to accept the premise that he alone is why Democrats had such an easy time getting their people to the polls. That is something he's not going to accept. But the fact that he goes out there, and Chuck Schumer, by the way, retweeted his comments and said, I agree with him. When Donald Trump goes out there and said the reason they lost was, one, Trump wasn't on the ballot. The inference there is because there's a whole bunch of low propensity voters that only show up when Donald Trump's on the ballot, right? We've seen this in 16 and 20, once again in 24. We've seen them in the midterms. They didn't show up in 18. They didn't show up in 22. And it looks like we're going to see a bit of the same thing in 26 because they didn't show up in 25. And then he also said, and this shutdown is killing the Republicans. So if you're Mike Johnson and John Thune, you've spent the last 6 weeks, I think feeling as if you had higher ground than the Democrats because it was Chuck Schumer's decision to sort of lead the Democrats into saying, no, we're not going to do this. We're going to, this was a shutdown instigated by the Democrats. And, when you've looked at the polling, it's been fairly, as I said, it all depends on how you want to spin the numbers, but the NBC poll offered 3 punches on who's to blame for the shutdown: Democrats in Congress, Republicans in Congress, or Donald Trump. Well, when you add up those that blame Trump with those that blame congressional Republicans, you get up to 52%. And it was 42% that blamed Democrats in Congress. So you could, but the offering was separately, right? And I think the only question I would have done is I might have added a 4th punch so that you could have had it a little more even. I might have said, progressives in the Democratic Party, because if, one of the theories of the case that some on the right have espoused, and some of us have wondered, that did Schumer do this because of pressure from the progressive base to confront Trump more? So maybe you offer that punch, and that way you can, I think, more evenly. I'm a little hesitant combining one set of numbers and comparing it to a standalone. That would be my only caution there. But it doesn't matter now, right? Perception is reality. And Donald Trump uttered the new reality. He's blaming Republicans in Congress and the Republican Party for the shutdown. How the heck now do we get? I mean, look, I really was a believer, and I thought, okay, everybody sees here, we're gonna land this plane in some form or another. You heard the conversation before Tuesday night. There were 8 Democratic senators starting to meet with a group of other Republican senators. They were coming. 8 is the magic number that they need in order that's the number of votes they need to get to 60 if they go with all the Republican votes here. And then this all happened. So now it's very interesting. You got Donald Trump blaming Republicans. So now you're going to get more Democrats feeling as if, okay, there's no penalty here for sticking to our guns. You're going to have a progressive base that is whispering in the ear of Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer, don't back down now. Not only did you not pay a price at the polls, you may have benefited from standing up to Donald Trump right now in the polls. Having good life insurance is incredibly important. I know from personal experience. I was 16 when my father passed away. We didn't have any money. He didn't leave us in the best shape. My mother, single mother now, widow, myself, 16, trying to figure out how am I going to pay for college. And lo and behold, my dad had one life insurance policy that we found. It wasn't a lot, but it was important at the time. And it's why I was able to go to college. Little did he know how important that would be in that moment. Well, guess what? That's why I am here to tell you about Ethos Life. They can provide you with peace of mind knowing your family is protected, even if the worst comes to pass. Ethos is an online platform that makes getting life insurance fast and easy, all designed to protect your family's future in minutes, not months. There's no complicated process, and it's 100% online. There's no medical exam required. You just answer a few health questions online. You can get a quote in as little as 10 minutes, and you can get same-day coverage without ever leaving your home. You can get up to $3 million in coverage, and some policies start as low as $2 a day. That would be billed monthly. As of March 2025, Business Insider named Ethos the #1 no medical exam instant life insurance provider. So protect your family with life insurance from Ethos. Get your free quote at ethos.com/Chuck. So again, that's ethos.com/Chuck. Application times may vary, and the rates themselves may vary as well. But trust me, life insurance is something you should really think about, especially if you've got a growing family. And look at all of the self-inflicted wounds Donald Trump is doing right now to his own party and to himself via the shutdown. Right? He does not have the discipline to 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 not to not confess or not to stick with a message that at least was getting them to even. But he threw the party under the bus. And this is going to be the real challenge, I think, going forward for elected Republicans. Because when you have a result like this in an off year, you're going to have we're hitting an interesting 6-week period where if you are on the fence about running for reelection, this is your final time, your final exit ramp before filing deadlines begin. In fact, there's some filing deadlines that are just about to come up right now for the early 2026 primaries. But for the most part, if you're going to retire, and maybe you thought you were going to run for reelection, you wanted to see what the political environment was going to be at the end of the year. Well, you've now got a taste because, if history is any guide, how these off year election goes, they absolutely foreshadow what's going to happen a year later, barring some unforeseen event that radically changes the political landscape. And given that we've lived through terrorist attacks and a pandemic, I'm not going to sit here and say that there's, no zero, the chances are zero. There's some event that just totally upends everything. But let's be realistic. It's more likely than not that won't happen. That if anything, we're going to continue to have this sort of uneven economy, an economy that those that don't have are going to feel like they're being left behind. So you're going to have an angry electorate on the economy. The tariffs are none of them do good for the economy, and in fact, we may get more chaos as it appears that the Supreme Court is going to say that Donald Trump is violating the Constitution with his tariff policy, and that this all has to. This is the power. This is a power that Congress has. It is not a power that the executive branch has, which will only set his agenda back even further. So, how many House Republicans decide, why do I got to pay Donald Trump's debt when Donald Trump's not on the ballot, right? Maybe I can win re-election if Donald Trump can get his voters out and I can suck it up and take the uncomfortable aspects of supporting Trump that come with it because he brings a different type of voter to the polls that nobody sees in polling, and it helps them win re-election. But if Donald Trump's not on the ballot, and you have to essentially, you get all the downside of Trump with none of the upside. Do you want to run for reelection if you're in a tough race? So the biggest development, I think, and the biggest piece of fallout that's coming is going to be that there's going to be some additional retirements. Throw in this redistricting madness that has taken place, right? Talk about a reminder. Be careful what pick your cliche. Be careful what you wish for. Or when it's easy to start a war, it's much harder to end it. So Donald Trump orders Texas to start this redistricting war. It rallies Gavin Newsom and organizes the California Democratic Party and unifies them in a way that they haven't been unified in decades. You've now got a record number of House delegates in the Virginia Assembly encouraging them now to do redistricting that will favor the Democrats. That will put more pressure on Maryland to join. Yes, there's been pressure put on your Indianas, your Missouris. Kansas has decided to pull back, but I imagine now, in for a dime, in for a dollar, you're going to see Trump go even harder at Kansas to have to do this. But the irony of all this is Donald Trump thought he was going to be gaining an advantage doing this. Democrats are fighting fire with fire. I'm sorry that the unintended consequence is going to be fewer competitive elections in general. But the larger outcome here is going to be we're going to go from a fairly even national map when it comes to House races to a fairly even national map after all these changes are made. Okay, so maybe you pick up 3 or 4 in Texas on the Republican side. Democrats may pick up 3 or 4 in California. Republicans may get 1 or 2 more in Indiana. Democrats may get 3 more in Virginia. Republicans may get 1 more in Missouri. They may get 1 or 2 more in North Carolina. Democrats could get another 1 or 2 if they choose to in a New York or even a New Jersey. The point is and then you had Ohio Republicans cut a deal that is a less aggressive map that Republicans could have embarked on. Look, the downside is just fewer competitive races. But I'll tell you this, too, because there's something else that developed out of the election night in 2025. A lot of Republicans, and this is always a mistake, never assume that your success in a presidential election year means your new coalition becomes durable. And I think a lot of Republicans thought, hey, look, we won these Latino voters. Now they're our voters. Just like Barack Obama in 2012 did extraordinarily well with Latinos. And so there it was. Democrats thought, there it is. They just have to do the young voters, black voters, and brown voters, and they win. And it turned out, nope. There was plenty of voters who were voting for Barack Obama who would go back to being up for grabs when Barack Obama wasn't on the ballot. And there's plenty of these working class voters, whether you're black, white, Hispanic, that are pocketbook sensitive. And they're going to vote for the candidate that is speaking to the issues they care the most about. Well, Donald Trump was talking about prices and cost of living issues in 2024. He's not doing that in 2025. Democrats in New Jersey and in New York City and in Virginia, one thing all 3 of those winners did that was similar was talk about cost of living issues. And guess what? They all did better with Latino voters than Kamala Harris did, who didn't talk about those issues. She closed with the democracy issue. So imagine redistricting Texas thinking, oh, look, we've got this new constituency of Latino voters that are now going to be Republican voters. No, they're not. They're swing voters, and they're probably going to be swing voters. By the way, the working class voter in America has always been the swing voter. If you look at politics more through class than you do identity, and I think that's been the mistake. I really believe it. I think the Democratic Party's mistake since Obama was assuming they won those voters on identity issues, not due to financial issues, which really is in translation class issues. Republicans went after these voters of color using class, not identity. And when you look at why, Reagan Democrats voted Republican, well, that was code for working class Democrats in the Midwest voted. Yes, there was certainly there was certainly a cultural connection on that front. But ultimately, they were voting on their own issues and its class issues. And so the working class vote in America, it's always been the swing vote. And the mistake Democrats made for the last decade was treating Latino voters like they were an identity group that belonged to the Democratic coalition, when ultimately many Latino voters are in blue collar jobs and are voting pocketbook issues. They don't look at the two parties as part of their identity. They look at the two parties the same way many voters look at the two parties. Which one is going to give me an opportunity for a better quality of life? This is where it goes, the infamous Carville line of "it's the economy, stupid." It's always, to a group of voters, it's always about their issues, their financial stability. So, bottom line, this wasn't a good night for Democrats. It was a great night for Democrats. To get over 60 seats in that Virginia House of Delegates, to me, foreshadows what could be the beginning of a blue wave election. Now, look, there's still a lot that could change things. The Republicans and Donald Trump have a ton of money. But I do keep an eye on this. It is going to be easier for a Republican. There's going to be many Republican candidates that are going to start to distance themselves from Trump in some form or another, or try to. I don't know if anybody can do it outside of Susan Collins, because she's been doing it for so long. She's just, in some ways, Maine voters do not consider her Trumpy. How does that work itself out? And the more vulnerable Trump looks, the weaker he looks, the more he's going to lash out, the more he's going to attack anybody that tries to essentially seek a little distance for him. I mean, look, Winsome Earl-Sears, she tried to have it both ways. She wanted the MAGA base, but she knew the Northern Virginia voters, right? It says a lot to me that Glenn Youngkin's 55% job rating, that 1 in 4 positive Youngkin job approvers voted for Abigail Spanberger. So, to me, it's another sign that this was as much about Trump as it was about anything else. If the Republican Party brand is non-Trump, they have an easier chance in some of these elections than they do when they're associated, when the Republican Party brand becomes synonymous with Trump's brand. And so that's what I'm going to be looking for over the next 6 weeks is, are you going to start to see more Republicans try to find their way to seek some distance? On some issues, it's going to be made easy for him. Supreme Court rules against his authority over tariffs. Watch how many Republican senators start to act more independently on the issue of tariffs. You already have seen it a little bit, right? He's putting pressure on them with the with nuking the filibuster. It's interesting who's with them. It is those that are in some ways more MAGA true believers. Your Josh Hawleys, your Jim Banks, they're all in. It's the institutionalists that are pushing back. And the Senate Republicans, there's still quite a few of the institutionalists there. There are two people that I'm very curious to see what they're going to have to say about the filibuster on that side of the aisle. One is Rick Scott and the other is Tom Cotton. Both have always sought approval of MAGA world, but they've always been in it's a fine line, right? They're a little bit my canaries in the coal mine. If they start to seek distance from Trump on something, it tells me that we might be seeing more Republicans abandon ship. But that's the big short-term development to keep an eye on. How Trump mishandles, frankly, the fallout from this election. He's already flailing. He is not accepting the premise that he creates this weather, and how elected Republicans walk this line and deal with it. I think it's going to be something to watch, and certainly something I'm going to keep an eye on. And it could be, in the words of Haley Barbour, good gets better, bad gets worse. Democrats had a good night, and this could improve candidate recruiting. They're going to suddenly have Senate candidates in Alaska and in Kansas and in places they've been trying to recruit, because you're going to have fence sitters say, hey, maybe this is a good year to run as a Democrat in a light red state like Kansas. And then on the opposite side, you may see bad gets worse. Republicans had a bad night. If you're on the fence about seeking reelection, you think Donald Trump's a drag, you don't get any of the upside of Trump being on the ballot, you may decide to retire instead of seek reelection. opening the door for more room for a Democrat to run. So this is why what happened on Tuesday night is so significant and potentially such a huge game changer going into 2026. Because guess what? I'm now in the 30 to 45% range in my head that Democrats could win control of both the House and the Senate. You get a uneven turnout, base turnout like you saw in 2025 on Tuesday, then you might get four Democratic Senate pickups, and certainly the handful of House seats that they need to get that. And that would be some rebuke going into 2028. There's a reason results matter more than promises. Just like there's a reason Morgan & Morgan has become America's largest injury law firm. For the last 35 years, they've recovered $25 billion for more than 500,000 clients. It includes cases where insurance companies offered next to nothing, short of shortchanging, seeing if they could get away with it. And Morgan & Morgan fought back, and they won millions. In Pennsylvania, one client was awarded $26 million. It was a staggering 40 times the amount that the insurance company originally offered. That offer, $650,000, whatever it took to sort of get away without paying. So with more than 1,000 lawyers across the country, Morgan & Morgan knows how to deliver for everyday people. So if you're injured, you're looking for a lawyer, check out forthepeople.com/ToddCast or dial pound law, pound 529 on your cell phone. And remember, all law firms are not the same. So give Morgan & Morgan a look. Their fee is free unless they win.